In January of 2002, 19-year-old Rachel Cooke went for a run near her family's house in Georgetown, Texas, during a holiday break from college. She was last seen on a trail near the family home by some neighbors, but she never actually made it back to her parents' house, and she's never been seen again. 23 years later, this case remains open, and there are frustratingly few answers as to what happened to Rachel Cooke. Hello, and welcome to Box in the Basement podcast. I'm your host, Arlene.
And I'm Leah.
In 1996, my world was shattered when my uncle Leon Laureles was shot execution style in a small town in Texas. To this day, his murder remains unsolved, and the pain of that injustice continues to haunt me, my family, and Leon's friends and coworkers. Here at Box in the Basement, we want to shed light on the overwhelming number of unsolved murders and disappearances here in Texas and beyond. We want to bring awareness to the lesser-known cases that got little to no attention, in hopes that someone listening will come forward with any information, because we strongly believe all lives matter. Ultimately, we want to get justice for Leon and for all the victims whose cases are sitting, collecting dust in a box in a basement. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Please like and follow our pages on all social media platforms for Box in the Basement podcast and Justice for Leon Laureles. And now you can also find us on YouTube.
2002 saw Switzerland joining the UN and 12 of 15 European Union nations adopting the euro as their official currency. SARS gave the world a decent scare, North Korea admitted to developing a nuclear weapons program, and Chechen rebels held 763 hostages in a theater in Moscow. Friendster was the most popular social media site with a whopping 3 million members. Puffy jackets and yoga pants were all the rage. American Idol made its debut. AOL was the most popular website, and Kmart filed for bankruptcy. The New England Patriots beat the St. Louis Rams in the Super Bowl. The Detroit Red Wings defeated the Carolina Hurricanes for the Stanley Cup. The Lakers swept the Nets for the NBA championship, and the Anaheim Angels beat the San Francisco Giants in the World Series. How You Remind Me by Nickelback was number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and Alan Jackson's Where Were You When the World Stopped Turning topped the country charts the week of January 10th, 2002. The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring was number 1 at the box office, and Skipping Christmas by John Grisham was at the top of the New York Times bestseller list for fiction. Georgetown, Texas is considered part of the Austin, Round Rock, San Marcos metropolitan area, and it sits just 30 miles north of the state capital. It's home to the oldest university in Texas, Southwestern University, and sits at the crossroads of 2 major railroads from the 19th century. The town grew steadily during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, but the population really started to explode after 2000. Today, Georgetown has a population of about 96,000, up from 29,000 in 2000. It's not a small town. The city I live in has about the same population, but it does hang on to some of that small town charm. It's got lots of historic buildings, quaint shops, restaurants, and access to lots of outdoor activities due to its proximity to the San Gabriel River and Lake Georgetown. Notably, it was the first city in Texas to be run entirely on renewable energy sources. While some people do work in Georgetown proper, mostly for the school district or county government, most residents commute to Austin or other nearby suburbs for work.
Rachel Louise Cooke was born in Georgetown, Texas on May 10, 1982, to parents Robert and Janet Cooke. Her mother describes her as vivacious, saying she wasn't afraid of putting herself out there and trying new things even as a child. She loved her friends, she was loyal and fun, she loved life, and she tried to live it to the fullest. She was on the cross-country team at Georgetown High School, and she continued doing distant runs after she graduated. That is key to our story today. She loved fashion above all else, and that passion took her to San Diego, California, where she was a freshman at San Diego Mesa College. She returned home to Georgetown in December 2001 for the holidays, where she resumed her early morning runs near her family's home. She had a regular 4-mile route she used along Navajo Trail in the North Lake subdivision of Georgetown. It was a sleepy, unassuming neighborhood in 2002. Big yards, picket fences, SUVs, dogs, porch swings, the American dream. Rachel's parents both worked. Her father, Robert, was a software engineer for IBM who commuted to Austin every day, and her mother, Janet, was a high school English teacher at the time. Robert and Janet picked Georgetown to settle in and raise a family because it was quiet and far enough away from the hustle and bustle of Austin proper. Crime rates were low. The schools are good, and it was a good place to start a family. They built their dream home in the North Lake subdivision on a 3-acre plot, where they raised Rachel and her younger sister Joanne. Their home was a nexus of the Cooke family. Relatives and friends often congregated at the Cooke household on holidays. That's my house. We have the biggest house and a pool, so we're usually the host on Thanksgiving and Christmas, kids' birthday parties, and everything in between. On the morning of Thursday, January 10th, 2002, Rachel was still enjoying her time off between semesters at her family's home, dozing on the living room couch while her parents went off to work and her younger sister left for school. Her plan was to stay in Georgetown through January 12th to attend a wedding, then return to San Diego to her boyfriend Greg, her friends, and her studies. Rachel texted her parents that she was headed out for a run, and she left around 9:30 a.m., and it is assumed that she took her usual route as neighbors witnessed her on Navajo Trail, about 200 yards from her house at 11 a.m.
So just to clarify, she was heading towards her house at this point. So then logically, we're assuming she was finishing up her run.
Yes, that's what the witness statements say. She never returned home, however, and she's never been seen again. Her father, Robert, had planned to go shopping with Rachel that afternoon, and he returned home at around 3 p.m., but Rachel wasn't there. Rachel also had a habit of calling her father during the workday, and she hadn't done so that day. It was unusual, but Robert wasn't alarmed yet. He assumed that she'd just gotten busy with friends, or maybe she'd picked up a shift at the local restaurant she sometimes worked at. Rachel did have plans to hang out with a friend that evening, and he considered the possibility that this friend picked Rachel up early. Later that evening, however, Robert called this friend, who, as it turned out, had not heard from Rachel at all. Robert called the local restaurant where Rachel works sometimes, and the manager said yes, Rachel had indeed picked up a shift that evening. Somewhat relieved, Robert and Janet relaxed and went back to business as usual. The next morning, Friday, January 11th, Robert and Janet realized that Rachel hadn't come home the night before. Robert called the restaurant again, and he was informed that a different Rachel had picked up a shift the evening before, not his daughter. Now the Cooke family went into panic mode. Something was definitely wrong. The Cookes started calling local hospitals and police stations. Robert drove Rachel's usual running route and spoke to neighbors who confirmed seeing Rachel that morning.
The investigation geared up quickly, with the county sheriff's office conducting a formal search of the area aided by hundreds of volunteers. The massive search was short-lived, however, lasting only through the following Monday. After the formal search was called off, the Cookes brought in Texas EquiSearch for assistance, and they conducted their own search that stretched out over 2 weeks before being called.
If you're not familiar, Texas EquiSearch is a mounted search and recovery team that's run by a guy named Tim Miller, whose own teenage daughter was abducted and murdered in the 1980s. It's a fantastic volunteer-operated organization that doesn't charge families a dime for their services. They've assisted families and law enforcement with literally thousands of missing persons cases and recovery efforts.
The Cooke family continued to run their own searches on weekends with friends, family, and volunteers for the next 9 months before finally coming to the realization that they weren't going to find her on their own. Instead, Robert Cooke turned to the media, spreading Rachel's story far and wide in the hopes of getting some piece of information in return. The family held multiple memorial services, candlelight vigils, went on every local TV program and radio show that would have them, and they started a website, they made bumper stickers and flyers, and they ran fundraisers. Anything to keep Rachel's face in the news and her story in the minds of the public.
Police developed a few sketches of persons of interest based on witness statements provided by people who saw Rachel that day. I've seen 4 sketches, and they look like 4 completely different people. Someone claimed to have seen a young white man speaking to a jogger in the vicinity of Rachel's route around that time on the morning of January 10th. But it's never been confirmed if that jogger was Rachel or another young woman. Neighbors also whispered rumors about a sketchy white Trans Am trolling around the area in the days leading up to Rachel's disappearance, but those leads faded pretty quickly. Jerry Dean, who was affiliated with Missing Persons of America at the time, went to Cooke's Georgetown neighborhood to put eyes on the area and speak to potential witnesses herself. An anonymous source told her that Rachel was being followed by 3 unknown men prior to her disappearance, but these men did not drive a white Trans Am. Jerry Dean also raised the question whether or not the men pictured in the police sketches who bore resemblance to the 3 men the anonymous source alleged were following Rachel may have been construction workers. While the Cookes had been on the North Lake subdivision for nearly 2 decades, there were a bunch of new homes under construction at the time of Rachel's disappearance. Police ran down over 2,000 tips in the following years, but nothing of any real value came of them aside from a tip in 2021 that an associate of Rachel's may have more information than he was letting on at the time. Police tried to track him down, but they didn't have much to go on, and to my knowledge, he was either never found or he was cleared. And that's pretty much where Rachel's case stalled for about 4 years. No real leads, no real persons of interest, no real information at all.
In 2006, Keith Michael Moore, a man serving a prison sentence for the 2003 murder of pregnant Round Rock woman Christina Moore, no relation by the way, claimed to have kidnapped Rachel Cooke, bludgeoned her to death, and then put her body in the Gulf of Mexico. He claimed he was out driving around looking for trouble on the morning of January 10th when he saw Rachel out running on her usual route. Moore claimed that he attacked Rachel, hitting her over the head with a hammer, and then taking her to a secondary location where he sexually assaulted her, killed her, and drove her to Matagorda Bay, where he wrapped her in a tarp, weighed her down with rocks, and disposed of her remains in the water. Now, Moore had been considered a person of interest in Rachel's disappearance, considering the circumstances of the crime he was currently serving time for. It's not as if this confession came out of thin air. Christine Moore was a 35-year-old woman who Moore restrained in her own bedroom closet before cutting her throat as her 15-month-old child slept in the next room. Moore was charged with Rachel's murder and went so far as to enter into a plea agreement with the Williamson County District Attorney, but he backed out shortly before the case went to court. It was a problematic situation anyway. There was zero physical evidence tying Moore to Rachel's disappearance, and there was even a question of whether or not his jailhouse confession would be admissible in court.
So part of the plea agreement was that Moore would get a lighter sentence in exchange for taking law enforcement to physical evidence that tied him to Rachel's death or her body or both. If he had nothing to do with her disappearance, then obviously he would not have been able to do that, which would open him up to much harsher punishment. So the deal disintegrated, and the episode ended with Moore pleading not guilty in his first hearing, claiming that he fabricated the entire confession. The DA plans to continue investigating Moore as a suspect, but the law required the murder charges to be dropped in the meantime, since Moore is currently in prison serving time for the other murder. He'll be eligible for parole in 2034, and if paroled, the Williamson County DA's office plans to charge him again if they can build an adequate case against him.
One of the most fucked up things about this confession is that Moore, whether or not he was involved in Rachel's disappearance, is messing with the Cooke family. And in turn, he's also messing with the family of Christine Moore, his victim. The media was rehashing Christine's murder in the papers and on TV broadcasts, and it gave false hope to the Cooke family that Rachel's case might have a resolution. Michael Moore is a piece of shit in any event.
In 2017, law enforcement received a tip that some human remains had been buried in a field near Georgetown and that they might be related to Rachel's case. Investigators were unable to locate any remains in the area indicated by the tipster. In 2018, investigators found a car that matched the description of the Pontiac Trans Am that neighbors had whispered about seeing in the North Lake neighborhood the day Rachel disappeared. It was a white 1998 Trans Am, and there was possible blood on the floorboard and door on the passenger side to boot. Forensic testing was done on the car, including DNA analysis on the possible blood found inside the car. But as it stands in early 2025, I don't believe anything useful has come from this investigation. I don't have a lot of information on the test results, but I would think that 7 years would be plenty of time to develop solid leads or narrow down a suspect list if the car was involved in Rachel Cooke's disappearance. Rachel's disappearance took a serious toll on the Cooke family. Janet and Robert divorced after Rachel's disappearance. The stress just became too much for their marriage. Robert became a shell of himself, living in fear for his younger daughter Joanne, and fighting tirelessly to keep Rachel's story in the public eye. Sadly, Robert Cooke passed away in 2014, and that brings us to present day. Rachel's mother, Janet, has struggled with mental illness in the years following her disappearance. Janet Cooke is realistic with her expectations. Rachel was a strong, fearless young woman. Janet believes that if Rachel was still alive, she would have found a way to get back home or at least make contact in the intervening years. Rachel's sister, Joanne, graduated from high school and went on to the University of Texas in nearby Austin. But it was not an easy transition. She considered Rachel her best friend, and moving on without her was clearly painful. Greg, Rachel's boyfriend, had a hard time moving on as well. In an interview I read that was published nearly 3 years after Rachel's disappearance, Greg had not been able to even go on a date with another woman. He was so distressed. I bring these things up because when a loved one is killed or goes missing without explanation, the ripple effects are devastating. It's not just the victim who suffers.
So what happened to Rachel Cooke?
So let's go back to the day she disappeared. She went out running in the morning around 9:30 a.m., and neighbors said they saw her heading back towards her house an hour and a half later at 11 a.m. I'm not a runner, but that seems like an awfully long time for a 4-minute walk. You walk 4 miles in less time than that.
Yeah, walking at about a 17-minute per mile pace gets me 4 miles in about an hour. If I'm lollygagging and do 18 minutes per mile, then it takes me about an hour and 15 minutes.
Now, this may seem nitpicky or weird, but Rachel was an experienced, distant runner. So, if she went for a run, she'd probably complete 4 miles in well under an hour. The reason we bring this up is to put eyewitnesses' claims into context. Several neighbors claimed they saw Rachel Cooke heading back to her home. But was it actually Rachel they saw? There's every possibility that Rachel went for a leisurely stroll that morning, and this level of dissecting the timeline is unnecessary. But there's no real indication that leisurely walks were her thing. Were the neighbors mistaken on the timeline? Did Rachel go farther than 4 miles that day? There are a lot of possibilities here. It's just something to consider when examining the few facts we have in this case.
Eyewitnesses are notoriously unreliable. It's not unreasonable to question the reported timeline or the witness statements at all.
So, the first possibility is that Rachel was abducted while she was out on her run that morning. Whether or not the neighbors actually put eyes on her, and whether or not the timeline is correct. The fact that no sign of her was ever found after the fact leads me to believe that this is the most likely possibility here. She went out for a run or a walk or whatever, and someone else snatched her up or lured her into their vehicle, and then that person took her away from the area. The question is, who?
The first and most obvious possibility, in my opinion, is Michael Moore, the man who confessed to Rachel's abduction and then retracted said confession. He's a convicted murderer. He lived in the area, and police were looking at him as a possible suspect in Rachel's disappearance anyway. And he confessed to the crime. I know there are all kinds of reasons people confess to crimes they didn't commit, but this one seems a little off the wall. Unless he thought the cops had enough evidence to connect him to the crime regardless, I don't really get why he would confess, especially if he was already serving time for another murder. But at the same time, there's a reason that criminal motives don't make sense to me. I'm not a criminal.
Right. It's kind of up in the air at this point. There's no information out there leading me to believe that the investigative team has built a solid case against Moore. But at the same time, the DA wouldn't be able to charge him until 2034 at the earliest anyway. So we really don't know anything yet.
What do we think about the theory that it was a construction worker in the area?
I think that that's entirely plausible as well. If you consider the fact that the 4 composite sketches that resulted from witnesses in the neighborhood all look completely different from each other, it's not unlikely that there were quite a few unfamiliar people hanging around the neighborhood. Construction crews often include folks with criminal records, so I don't think it's out of the question at all that a random crew member helping to build houses in the area either kept tabs on Rachel and picked his moment to strike, or that this was an opportunistic crime. Someone saw her running or walking in the neighborhood, and they acted on impulse. There really isn't any hard evidence to back up this theory, or any other theory for that matter.
And then there was that anonymous tip that claimed Rachel was being stalked or followed by a group of unknown men prior to her disappearance. That would line up more with the theory that it was a construction worker or group of workers that were responsible for her disappearance. But then again, it's all speculation at this point. There's just so little to go on.
As with any instance of a missing adult, we have to acknowledge the possibility that Rachel left on her own accord, though I think it's a stretch in this case. Rachel was happy with her life. She had plans for that day, she was going to a wedding that weekend, and she was looking forward to reuniting with her boyfriend and starting classes in San Diego the following week. There was no indication that she was experiencing any kind of stress or turmoil that might lead her to want to run away and start over without letting anyone know. She came from a tight-knit family. She was financially stable. She had a good support system. Running away just doesn't make any sense here. She also left her phone and wallet behind, which is a pretty clear indication that she was intending to return to her parents' home.
Right. This was 2002, and cell phones weren't as capable or integrated into our lives as they are now, but still, leaving it behind is a huge indicator that she was taken against her will, especially considering that she left her wallet behind too. We relied on a lot more physical cards and cash back in those days. There was no Samsung Pay or Google Wallet or anything like that. You actually had to pull paper money or a debit card out of your wallet in most cases to pay for things. You swiped your debit card too. No tapping, nothing like that.
That is where we are as of January 2025. Rachel Cooke disappeared from her home in Georgetown, Texas, on the morning of January 10th, 2002. She was 5'3" and weighed around 115 pounds. She had blonde hair with highlights and lowlights, and had 2 heart-shaped cherries tattooed on her left shoulder, a black star tattooed on her left foot, and has multiple ear piercings and a navel piercing. She was last seen wearing gray running shoes, a green sports bra, and Asics running shoes. She ran with a yellow Sony Walkman that she wore strapped to her arm. If you have any information related to her disappearance, please contact the FBI at 1-800-225-5324 or submit a tip online at tips.fbi.gov. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the podcast creators, host, and guest. We are excited to announce that we are now a part of the Darkcast Network.
Do you feel stuck? Stuck in a relationship? Just stuck in your life? Well, then you've come to the right place. Well, I guess I came and found you. True Crime Connections Advocacy Podcast talks with survivors of all different kinds of trauma. But one thing is the same, is they all started on their healing journey. Join us as we talk with survivors or professionals every Thursday, where we not only learn, but we laugh. You can find True Crime Connections on all podcast platforms, and you can also go to truecrimeconnections.com. We'll talk to you later.
Many true crime audience members want to take action. Do you? Here's how you can help. We need an attorney. Do you know anyone willing to work pro bono? The Homicide Families Victims' Rights Act is a new piece of legislation that has yet to be interpreted. So it's a great opportunity for a firm to help shape what justice looks like for families like us in the future. Join our community on one of the social networks. Check out our Facebook pages, Justice for Leon Laurelis or Box in the Basement Podcast, and on Insta at Box in the Basement Podcast. We share updates, photos, and episode information. And now you can also find us on YouTube. See you there. One of the next steps in our Justice for Leon journey is exhuming his body for additional evidence, but it's upwards of $15,000. So please help by donating at our GoFundMe, Justice for Leon. Please sign my petition for the Brownwood Police to re-examine the case. We've been told so many lies. It's time for the Brownwood Police to take responsibility and accountability. One signature can make all the difference. Also, visit our website, justiceforleon.com. You can also join our email list to stay current on developments on Leon's case and other cases we cover as they happen. Thank you for joining us. Be kind. Later, Gators.